So here we are picking up in our period 6. This would be the second PowerPoint presentation today, talking about innovations and technology, um, and a couple other things. But looking at innovations and technologies, like we talked about in class, this is a time period where big business is really going to come to the forefront. The first big business that we really talked about were the railroads. But there's a lot of other things that come to fruition during this time period. So we're going to explore some of those today. Some of the inventions, just the tip of the iceberg, of some of the inventions that come to reality during this time period, like the telegraph, for example. The telegraph was developed by Samuel F.B. Morse, and the telegraph enables people to be in touch from one state to another, um, and eventually even transatlantically. So the transatlantic cable comes to the forefront, which sends messages across the seas in minutes, which is pretty amazing. Also, the typewriter, the telephone, the cash register, a calculating machine, if you will, an adding machine, a camera, a fountain pen, a safety razor, and a blade. When you think about it now, in this time of technology, these seem like small potatoes, but the reality is it's a pretty big deal for this time period. So now that all of these things are being invented, we have to figure out how we're going to market them and how we're going to sell them to everyday people like you and me who essentially have not necessarily had the money before to buy these types of things, but now we can. So we got to figure out, or industry has to figure out how they're going to sell them. So this time period is going to be the birth of department stores like Macy's, which is founded in New York, and Marshall Field, which is founded out in Chicago. We're also going to see Woolworths, which is a store I grew up with in New York. We called it the Five and Dime. This became a nationwide chain store that was located in towns and urban neighborhoods. And essentially, you could get anything you needed there, from clothing to stamps to you can buy lunch at the lunch counter, just anything that you needed. It was kind of like a Walmart, but less big, actually. And I don't believe when I was a kid you could buy food. I mean, like grocery store type food at the Woolworths, but I might be wrong. Also, we're going to see the advent of mail order catalogs. Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward. Um, they would send you a catalog of goods they had. You would order them, send your money, and they would send you whatever it is that you ordered. We're also going to see packaged goods, processed goods. So, like Kellogg's cornflakes did not exist before this time period. Cereals that you can buy in a box didn't happen, and that's new. And then also the process of canning vegetables and fruits and meat, of course. This is something that people did in their own homes. You didn't go to a store to buy a can of vegetables or a can of fruit. Um, but now, with the advent of this kind of production, that's what's happening. And that really changes the way people are living their daily lives. So, what's the impact of industrialization? Industrialization, of course, creates a new class of millionaires. It also creates a gap between the very rich, the middle class, and the very poor. And this gap becomes very evident. And the very poor live extremely hard, and the very rich live extremely well, obviously. Somewhere in the middle, in that middle class, people are doing well, but some of those people living in the middle class are a paycheck or so away from dropping from that class. So just something to keep in mind. In 1890, the 11 million of the 12.5 million families lived on an average yearly income of less than $380, which to us is an unbelievable number. But to them, but back then, it's also a small number, but they were still able to afford things they couldn't before. Middle management was needed to coordinate the operations between chief executive and factories, therefore leading to good paying jobs for middle class workers. Lower class workers, of course, were paid the smallest wages. Women step up like they have in all the other periods that we've talked about, and they are going to start working outside of the home as a necessity and also because they want to earn a little bit of their own money. By 1900, 1 out of 5 adult women are in the labor force. Most women who are in the labor force are young and single. Only 5% of married women worked outside the home. Of course, if they were married, their job reverted back to taking care of the home and having babies and letting the men take care of the finances and making the money and so on and so forth. Women mostly worked in textile, garment, and food processing industries. And later, they became secretaries, bookkeepers, typists, and telephone operators. Switching gears a little bit, we're going to start talking about the struggle of organized labor. So some of these people that were working and toiling in conditions that were not great, and they weren't even great. They were below great, if you can believe that. Substandard and pretty terrible. They also worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and they had, of course, little pay. Some of the hardest and most dangerous jobs would be like mining, and believe it or not, in the meat packing industries, people were absolutely could have their limbs removed. They could get severely burned. Anything that you're working in a factory is dangerous. And the idea that you know employers wanted to get the most bang for their buck, so they did as little as they could to provide safety and all that they could to provide increased production. And that meant, working super long hours and paying people not a whole lot of money, but people were willing to do it because they needed some money. Cheap labor and a surplus of it allowed management to hold most of the power. Industrial warfare. With a surplus of cheap labor, immigrants management, immigrants. So immigrants are the cheap labor. Oh,
Hi.
do you want to talk about U.S. history?
No.
Okay, awesome. So the cheap labor is coming from this huge wave of immigrants that continues to pour into the United States, which is great for factories and industry because they will work for wicked cheap and they don't really care what their working conditions are. I mean, of course they care about it, but they need to make money and they're happy to work and make that money. So management held most of the power in the struggles with organized labor. People that went on strike could easily be replaced by bringing in scabs, and scabs are essentially what we call strike breakers, people who cross the picket line and go to work regardless of what the rest of their friends or family believe, like if they should be striking. But you also need to feed your kids. So being a scab, um, you know, it wasn't, you were looked down upon by the people if you were a scab, but you were valued a little bit by the employers, because you showed up to work. Employers had some tactics for defeating unions. They did a lockout. A lockout means closing the factory to break or labor movement before it could get organized. Blacklists. People who were pro-union workers were put on lists, and it was hard to find a job if you were on this list. In any factory that you went to or any work that you went to, if you were on this list, it kind of meant that you were a troublemaker. So they didn't want to hire you. Yellow dog contracts, workers being told as a condition for employment that they must sign an agreement not to join a union. And finally, they would call in private guards and state militia to put down strikes if it was necessary. An example of one such union labor strike would be the Grand Railroad Strike in 1877. This is one of the worst outbreaks of labor violence. The railroad cut wages in order to reduce costs, which was something that was pretty typically done. Again, keeping the emphasis on production. So essentially, since they were trying to reduce costs, they're putting their product and their priority in front of, the people who depend on their paycheck. However, this was during an economic depression, so they're trying to make cutbacks. But the strike started with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and quickly spread across 11 states and shut down 2/3 of the country's rails. So this was a significant strike. The president at the time, who was Rutherford B. Hayes, had to use federal troops to end the violence. 100 people total were killed. And after the strike, some employers addressed the workers' issues by improving wages and working conditions. This brings us to the National Labor Union in 1866. What the National Labor Union tried to do was organize all workers, skilled and unskilled, agricultural and industrial. So they had a big task in front of them. They wanted higher wages and an 8-hour workday. They also wanted social programs that would benefit the people that were working, equal rights for women and blacks. They also wanted monetary reform. This is a pretty hefty goal list here, and they certainly didn't achieve all of them. However, they did win an 8-hour workday for workers employed by federal government, so at least that was a step in the right behavior. Another major labor group movement at this time was the Knights of Labor. Started in 1869 as a secret society. They were open to all workers, including women and African American, and they had 3 goals. They wanted worker cooperatives, essentially to make man his own employer. They wanted to get rid of child labor, and they wanted to get rid of trusts and monopolies because they did not feel like they were good for business. An incident that they were involved in is the Haymarket bombing, which happens in May of 1886. It involved 80,000 Knights that were there for a strike. Happened in Chicago. Workers were attending a public meeting. Police attempted to break it up. Someone threw a bomb, which killed several police officers. People associated the violence of this event with unions, and then unions became somewhat unpopular. Another group is the American Federation of Labor, which came about in 1886 and was led by Samuel Gompers. They specifically catered to craft unions, and they wanted higher wages and improved working conditions. They directed workers to walk out until their employer agreed to negotiate their demands. Oops. They were involved a little bit in the Homestead strike, which was led by Henry Clay Frick, who was a guy that was a manager that worked for Andrew Carnegie. And the strike happens at the Homestead Steel Plant, which is in Pittsburgh. While Andrew Carnegie was away on vacation in Scotland, Frick decided to cut wages of his employees by 20%, which is very significant. He used weapons, or he used the means of lockout, private guards, and strike breakers to defeat the strike. And this failure actually sets the unions back and makes it seem like the unions aren't like doing their job or aren't worth their weight. So that's what we have for you today. When we come back next time, we're going to talk about the growth of cities and American culture. Hope you're having a great day. Bye.